Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 of STEM Challenge, and the title of this chapter is Life from the First Organism Onward, sections 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3. In this chapter we'll have Earth forms and life begins, the evolution of multicellular life, and classification. How do we classify all this life we have? One of the central questions that human beings have had ever since we've been on this planet is, how did life get here? And the answer to this, as far as science knows the answer, we'll talk about in this chapter. Please keep in mind that these screencasts are meant as an overview, and that you should really read and study and take notes so that you're prepared for the quiz on each of these chapters. So in 9.1, we'll talk about how scientists learn about the history of life on the planet, describe how the planet first formed, organize the first organic molecules, talk about those, and a couple other things. So let's take a look. This is a 24-hour clock. Here's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4, 5, 6, 12 o'clock, 1800, and 24. And what they're trying to do with this 24-hour clock, this metaphor for the life on Earth, is try and give you a sense of how long life has been here. Now, we're going to use this metaphor, the 24-hour clock, this way, and in another way I'll show you in a second. But if we take a look at this, remember right up here is when our Earth formed. It was a molten core, a hot molten core, and eventually it cooled down so that solid rock. Well, just after solid rock formed, we get evidence in microfossils of the first prokaryotic life, the first bacteria-like life on the planet. The first type of photosynthesis occurred right about here, and then many hundreds of millions of years later, the first free oxygen was put into our atmosphere. The first evidence of eukaryotic cells is found here, just before, I should say. This is 12, just before 1 o'clock in the morning. First multicellular life is here. Animals, first land vertebrates here, mammals, flowers. But look at this. This tiny slip of time are the first hominids, and hominid is a term which means the first human-like organisms. So we know that our Earth is about 4.54 billion years old, and that's a really big number, and a hard number to get in your head. 1 billion years is 1,000 million years. So I've taken this chart and I've organized it in a way that I think might be a little bit easier. It's that same 24-hour clock, but if the Earth forms here, 21 hours later is this. So 21 of the 24 hours, this is represented right here in this section. And we had something called the Cambrian Explosion, which you'll read about. And that's when there was a huge proliferation of life on our planet. But that happened about 500 million years ago. And the last 3 hours, all of these things have happened. Most life up here was unicellular, and it was in the ocean. You're going to hear a lot about an experiment called the Miller-Urey Experiment. And the Miller-Urey Experiment is trying to figure out how one-celled life could seemingly appear out of nothing. It's a really interesting experiment. We'll look at that a little bit later. There are a number of ways that we know about the past, the deep past of our Earth, and one of the most central is the fossil record. Fossils are preserved remains or traces of organisms that lived in the past. And there's a couple different ways that fossils can be preserved, but most of the time it's in sedimentary rock, and we'll take a look at those as we go through this chapter. But the fossil record is one of the key ways that we know what's happened in the past. We can tell how old a fossil is by dating it in two different ways. One is called relative dating and absolute dating. Relative dating means where is it in the rock layer compared to other fossils. Absolute dating is when we use a radioactive clock, something like carbon-14 or potassium-argon. Carbon-14 only is good to about 50,000 years ago, so it's not very good at all. But certain types of rock have potassium-argon, and we can date those for billions of years ago. But let's take a look at this. Here's an example of relative dating. If we find down in this rock layer that I'm circling now, that's a trilobite, And we know that most of the trilobites fall in this rock layer. Well, we know that that trilobite is much older than this shark's tooth if we find it up in this rock layer. So as we go up, these are younger fossils. As we go down, older fossils. Another way that we can date organisms is sometimes, if we have the right type of evidence, we can combine that with a molecular clock. A molecular clock uses DNA sequences to estimate how long it's been since the species diverged from a common ancestor. And they're based on the assumption that mutations accumulate at a steady rate over a given period of time. For an example, take a look at this table 9.1 from your text. Notice that chimps have a 98% similarity to human DNA. Now, that doesn't mean that we evolved from chimpanzees. We didn't, but we did share a common ancestor. Notice that a mouse has an 85% similarity, and the fruit fly 44%. So the less similarity, the further back in time those two species had a common. This is another timeline from your book, and I like this timeline, but it's a little misleading. Let me show you why. You see right over here, it's called the Precambrian era. The Precambrian era lasted from when the Earth was 4.6 billion years old to when it was about 544 million years ago. So this is a very long period of time when most life was simple, unicellular, and in the ocean. But then right here, 544 million years ago, began the Cambrian Explosion, when all of a sudden there was this unbelievably burst of life, plant life, animal life, all different types of life. It got bigger, it got more diverse. And all of that has happened within the last 544 million years. How do we know that? We know that mostly from the fossil record and from dating the rocks that those fossils are in. Here's another way to look at that timeline. Up here, this is 4 billion years ago, or as they have 4,000 million years ago, the same thing. 2.5 billion years ago. Notice that most of the life that was on the planet was simple, bacteria-like. It gets a little more complicated here, but still all ocean-going life. Then, 400 million years ago, when we had this Cambrian explosion, which started up here 500 million years ago, there's just this unbelievable outbreak of life on the planet. Larger organisms, more prolific organisms, more diverse. Here's another metaphor that you can use for the how long life has been on the planet, and this is just using your arm. Notice that most of the arm is when it's eukaryotic, prokaryotic, but it's only right here in the middle of almost where your fingers begin that the Cambrian explosion starts, and we have all of these events up until our fingernails, which are human-like creatures. So we haven't been around all that long, and the fossil record surely tells us that. A very important experiment that we'd like to tell you about is an experiment called the Miller-Urey Experiment. And in the Miller-Urey Experiment, this was the setup. They were trying to simulate what the Earth was like just as living cells began to show up in the fossil record. That was a long time ago. It was almost 4 billion years ago. So what they did was they took a closed system. This is all glass, clear glass, and they simulated what would be water evaporating off of the ocean. They simulated a spark to be lightning, and they had water, methane, ammonia, carbon monoxide, a little bit of hydrogen. They would cool it down, they'd turn the water back in, and it would recirculate through. Well, in the next slide, we have it linked to a wonderful animation which explains what the Miller-Urey experiment was. And it's real important for you to watch this and understand it. But the important takeaway here is we can start with simple inorganic molecules, and we can produce simple amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, in a relatively short time, which was an amazing discovery at the time. Next in your text, they talk about the first cells and how the first cells probably had RNA in them and not DNA. It's the hypothetical first cell, because remember, we're talking about very, very small fossils, and we have to hypothesize what was in them. Here's an article about the oldest fossils ever found on Earth, which was about 3.5 billion years ago, so 3,500 million years ago. This is a really good animation on a theory called endosymbiosis, how cells in the early stages when our planet was just forming, how our cells cooperated to make larger eukaryotic cells. And that's what this talks about, the evolution of eukaryotes, how we went from prokaryotic small bacteria cells into larger eukaryotic cells with a nucleus. Read about radiometric dating. We talked a little bit about them. It's like having a clock in your rocks once they have solidified. It's really interesting. The potassium-argon clock is one of the most famous ways to date rock and figure out how old they are. We have the periodic table of the elements. Read about that. We talked briefly about carbon-14, only good up until about 50,000 years ago. So good to date some of human cloth, human bones, but not great to go back millions or billions of years ago. At this point, we're going to visit a website from the Smithsonian, and we're going to look at the age of humans, which is only the last few million years old, not a very long period of time. You may not know this, but these are all different human-like organisms that have been found, that fossil evidence has been found. So I think you might find this interesting. You will also find big major milestones in human evolution, when we walked upright, when we used tools, when we used fires, when we started with a larger brain, and when we slowly started to domesticate food. So I think you'll find this interesting, and this is linked in the slide presentation for you to take a look at. This is a video. It's a little dated now, but I really think it does a nice job talking about human-like organisms and what happened over the last 6 million years. Remember, 6 million years seems like an incredibly long time to us, but not very long when you're talking about the whole history of the Earth. In section 9.2, your text is going to talk about the evolution of multicellular life. And this is now all the life after the Cambrian Explosion. Remember, after this, life changes dramatically on our planet. Also, I thought you'd find this interesting. This is today. Today, if we're looking at our atmosphere, it's about 20%, a little bit less than 25% oxygen, and most of it is nitrogen. But when our Earth first formed, it was mostly helium, hydrogen, ammonia, and methane. Notice how our atmosphere's composition has changed over time. That's an important diagram. We're going to look at different eras like the Paleozoic. You don't have to memorize the dates or anything like that, but note what happens in each of the eras as we go from older to newer. In the Triassic, some of the major milestones. The Jurassic, you've probably heard about the Jurassic from Jurassic Park, the movie. And finally, the Cretaceous. The Tertiary, and we are now in the Quaternary period, which is from about 1.8 million years ago to today. So you can read about some of the major milestones in each of those periods and their timeline. The last section talks about the classification of life, and it talks about the Linnaean classification and using the binomial nomenclature, where we use genus and species. Here's an example of that when we're talking about human beings, the human species. We are in the kingdom of animals. We are in the phylum of chordates, that's animals with a backbone. We are mammals, those are chordates with fur and have milk glands. We're primates, we have collarbones and grasping fingers. Then hominids, relatively flat faces with 3D vision, three-dimensional vision. We're in the genus Homo and in the species Sapiens, so Homo sapiens. This is how we classify all life, whether it's plants or animals, and you should read about that and study that. Here's a phylogenetic tree that looks at bacteria, the three major forms of life on the planet: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. We're eukarya because we have large cells with nuclei in them. A tool that is, I'd like to mention and like you guys to take a look at this, is a new tool that's out now for editing DNA. Is called Crispr. And Crispr is very controversial, but it may help us with many things, including COVID-19. So please take a look and know what CRISPR is. You don't have to watch. This is the one of the major biologists, Jennifer Doudna, who discovered CRISPR, and she has a warning for everybody about its use. You don't have to worry about this video or this one, but make sure that you watch this on CRISPR. Good luck, and good luck on the quiz.